welcome everybody to the Just Our 2 Cents podcast. Today's special edition of the Rehab Corners. And Rehab Corners is simply just talking everything rehab in simple terms, plain language for everybody to understand, and just debating these topics as well as we can. And once again, just our opinion. So, what's on the menu today, Wade?
We're talking butts, Ian. we're talking butts. Stuart McGill, Dr. Stuart McGill, came out with this article that appeared in Men's Health and causing like havoc on Twitter called gluteal amnesia. And guys are going crazy with this topic. I mean, you got guys on either side of this fence going crazy with it. What's your thoughts on gluteal amnesia, man?
Look, firstly, I think it's a hilarious term. I love it, and I'm probably going to use it a lot in...
Also known as dead butt syndrome, by the way. Dead butt syndrome, yeah.
But the gluteal amnesia, I'm definitely going to steal from Stuart if he doesn't mind. But yeah, once again, I think, social media is going crazy again with all of these Twitter warriors going on about semantics, really. I mean, my big thing is that it doesn't really matter necessarily what you call something, particularly not to the client, what matters is the results that you get and the goal that you want to achieve. And I think Stuart maybe fell in a little bit of a trap with the semantics and the words that he used, but ultimately his goal was to try and get people to be aware that when you're performing certain tasks, particularly when you're coming back from injuries, you can sometimes have trouble activating or firing the glute, or whatever word you want to use. And I think that's the point that he was trying to get across, which is something we can all identify with, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. It's the whole age of social media, so we want this play on words, but, amnesia doesn't mean totally brain. It kind of does, because, neuromuscular component comes into that, and it's simple kind of reciprocal inhibition that he's chatting about,
Yeah.
He's basically saying, if I don't use something for very long, or I'm in a position where the opposite muscle is becoming tighter, making the glute weaker. For example, the hip flexor is becoming a bit tighter, the glute's getting it's lengthened and weak, compressed because of things like seated positions, that it might not mean that it doesn't fire. It might not just fire on time or fire when you need it to, so you get these guys that are sitting at desk all day, but they're runners. So once they, get home from work and they go for a run, the glute's not firing as well as they like it to, because it's been compressed all day, it's been lengthened all day, so it might not fire the way we'd like it to,
And I think you would agree, we see this quite often in clinical practice with people. And for me, the problem just comes in where there's a sort of a divide on what the research is saying and what the clinical practice is actually proving. And particularly when it comes to this topic, a lot of the people who refute the research base that on some of the EMG studies that were done, or the majority of the research is based on EMG studies. And EMG studies can be controversial because they're very tricky, and there's a whole lot of moving parts going on. But I think, if we can take the base idea out of what it's trying to prove and then see how it works in clinical practice, ultimately, if I want a client to be able to stand up better from a chair or be able to run better, and I see that there's an inefficiency in the way that limb is being used, and I see that the inefficiency is coming mainly from the glute not doing whatever it's supposed to be doing in that particular task, I'm going to be advocating that person tries and use that glute better in whatever way I can,
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think a key word you use there is clinical practice, So what we see in research, in theory, and more the academic side doesn't always translate as well into the practical setting and vice versa, So we kind of sometimes, it's probably terrible to say, but take it with a bit of a pinch of salt as well, If we can apply that to one individual, doesn't necessarily mean it will help with a different individual. So we also have to kind of really be aware what works in the clinical setting, when we're using these techniques or these information we get from articles, and not if I don't believe in something that, like for example, if I don't believe in gluteal amnesia, that it's wrong, that it does not exist, So I think we have to be a little bit more open-minded as therapists, and when we're taking or reading these articles, these studies, and how we can apply it into our clinical practice.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say is some of the some of the typical examples of how you would incorporate it into clinical practice?
Man, for me, a lot of the time, it's I usually talk about deficits, and especially with me, I love pelvic stability, but that's another can of worms when people talk about Diana Lee and calling us cult. But for me, it's like, the glute might be firing, but the sequence is off. I might be using a little bit more quad and a little bit more hamstring, or a little bit more of the hip flexor to kind of create that stability, where I want more my primary stability to come from the glute medius or the glute min, So it's just finding ways to kind of isolate that movement and kind of retraining a neural pathway to that, from the brain to the muscle, to find that way. And I mean, maybe in that case, the wording makes a bit more sense, that the brain, amnesia, has forgotten how to activate in that sequence, So play on words might have been misunderstood, and now caused a Twitter war.
And I mean, what you said is quite important, because it brings us back to something that we always talk about. And one of the key things in terms of rehab is getting the client to understand that the most important thing is getting the brain involved from the get-go. And like, if that's not firing, if your brain's not firing, then you can forget about your glute or any other muscle is dead.
Exactly, that's so important. That's such an important concept, that what initiates a muscle to fire. It comes from input from the brain. And for a client to understand that, I actually have to kind of, I always joke about the whole Kill Bill scene with move, toe, move, and she's like talking to that muscle group to work. And it's exactly the same when we try to reteach movement or re-educate a movement. It's really having that neuromuscular connection when you're rehabbing.
Yeah. So just to play devil's advocate a little bit here now, what do you say to those people? And these are people who are obviously on the other side of the fence now, throwing these rocks at poor Stuart McGill. What do you say to them when they talk about like the language that we use? And I can understand it to a certain extent with clients, and not creating the sense of fear or calamity. Like something's gonna be falling apart, and my glute's dead, so now it's never gonna be working. Like I can understand it to a certain extent, but yeah, I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, like I think we always chat about knowing your patient. It's a little tricky when you're putting it out there in the world on such a big stage, as Stuart did. For the world to see that information, and not everyone agrees with it. I think the words we use is so important. Definitely not wanting to create fear, but more the education and the understanding part. So if you can find a way to get your patient to understand what is happening, they buy into doing the rehab and doing the management to kind of set them on that path to recovery. One of Stuart's patients might have just found that gluteal amnesia worked for them, and he ran with it. So it's just the wording for me. Like, it could be said in so many other ways. Dead butt syndrome comes from, oh, it's scary, it's dead. But it's just kind of an approach to kind of educate the patient. And I think that is 101 for me. Educating the patient to understanding this is the problem, this is what we need to do. We need to perform, let me not say perform CPR on this glute before we get crucified. But get that glute to fire again, and get it to work, and do what it needs to do to support the system.
Because all at the end of the day comes down to communication. The clients couldn't care stuff about who's debating what, until they want to know how quickly am I getting back, and is this going to be a permanent thing. That's all they want to know. And you've got to really know that person to know how to communicate to them. And some people will kind of gravitate or grab hold of that gluteal amnesia term. Some people will find it a little bit too spacey, and they might push back at that. But once again, it's about communicating what you want the client in order to achieve at the end of the day.
Exactly. And I think between the two of us, we hands-on physios, we less on the academic side of things. I wouldn't say that. We are definitely nerds, we definitely keep up with the reading, but we more kind of getting the patient back to where they need to be, So I understand that maybe the academics out there that are more kind of in research and things like that, they might disagree with that terminology, and maybe not. Maybe it's more the actually hands-on guys that don't believe in gluteal amnesia, and feel that there are different systems. But like I said, it doesn't mean that if you don't believe in something, that it does not work. So yeah, I just think it's more, if you're hands-on, 101 for me is we got into this game for the patients to kind of make a difference with them, and for me education is probably the biggest part of that.
Yeah, that is definitely where you can make the biggest change for a client's life, I think, or just in terms of the injury. But something that we also probably need to discuss is that, or acknowledge at least, is that different tasks definitely, or different exercise definitely recruit different muscles. So a particular exercise that you might use might not recruit this particular glute as well as some other exercise, man. And there are differences in tasks and differences in the exercises, and being able to choose which one is appropriate for a particular client, or appropriate for a particular task, or whatever level they're at, that also makes a huge difference, and people don't necessarily look at it that way. It's like your glute is dead, so your glute is dead. It's never going to wake up again.
Exactly. Or they might disagree with us. Many a times I'll tell them, okay, so your glute's weak. I should have specified, and they're like, how can that be? Yeah. I squat this much, I do this much lunges, I'm deadlifting this amount of weight. But for us to be clear, like, okay, these are gross movements, we are looking at stability, for example, and we're looking more at that glute med kind of segment and things like that. And then, that's kind of an eye-opening exercises, to get this, we got to go and do the small, slow, controlled movements to get these muscles to activate. And in that way, they kind of, their eyes get opened a little bit to understand, okay, so this muscle does this function in my body, but these group of muscles, they create the stability, they create the foundation for these big movements to happen. So like you said, education.
And there's no doubt, sorry to cut you off, there's no doubt that, some muscles probably aren't, or how can I put this now? I'm trying to find a way of saying that people don't necessarily understand how to maybe activate or recruit, and I know these words are tricky to use, but certain muscles. So however you can get it across for them that this is what you want this person to do for this particular task, and you can show them that, for instance, I can squat maybe 150 kilograms, but are you able to control that particular limb at high velocity, or when you change angles and when you're running, and how can you do that if you're unable to just hold the leg up against gravity, for instance, in a certain plane or in a certain movement. And also, we have to also acknowledge that the body is able to adapt, so it doesn't necessarily mean that because your glute isn't firing optimally for that particular task, your body won't find a way for you to do it, man, without you noticing the adaptations that it has to go through to do that. But where we come is trying to point out to them, or trying to assist them in making those movements more efficient. So even though your body is able to do the task, it can probably do it a lot more efficiently, and that's kind of what we want to try and get them to do, ultimately, I feel.
Yeah, man. I think that's kind of where we sit on this fence, kind of in the middle, maybe?
Probably. We'll probably get sore butts or dead butts from something like that.
So dead butts when we do that. But like, I'm definitely, I'm definitely more on the side where Stuart is saying that the glute's not firing and this causes us injury or makes you more injury prone kind of in the future, and I'm definitely on that side. But I'm also saying that maybe he got caught up a little bit in the word usage, if I can say that, and and I think maybe if the other guys take it with a pinch of salt and kind of more understand the concept, you don't have to argue about all these silly things sometimes.
And I think it's also maybe important just to point out that we do have a lot of love for Stuart McGill, because he's a world-renowned researcher and clinician, and he really knows what he's talking about. So all this hate that the guy's getting, I think it's really.
It's unfortunate. It's this guy's amazing at what he does, and I'm sure you've learned a couple of tricks from him. So have I. So yeah, man. So yeah.
Well, I'm certainly still going to be telling my patients to wake their butts up and to try and stimulate the gluteal memory, I guess.
Yeah, that's not going to change from us. So I'm definitely going to tell them to recover from gluteal amnesia.
Yeah, looking forward to the next rehab corner.
Yeah, man, guys, let us know if you guys like this. Any comments or questions, please drop in the comments.
Yeah, I'm hoping to see a lot of butt comments. Should be good.
Sure.
Cheers.